an Argentinian-born professor of sociology, and is currently the director of the Center for Engaged Research at Dublin City University. As a political sociologist, Professor Munck has written widely on the impact of globalization on development, changing work patterns, and migration. He's authored or co-edited more than 30 books, and his work has been cited more than 7,000 times. The second speaker in the session is Dr. Nicola Barsdorf. She's currently the Research Integrity Officer for Stellenbosch University. Her role includes formulating and revising policies and procedures to govern responsible conduct of research, promoting and raising awareness of responsible conduct of research, and receiving any allegations of breach of research norms and standards. Professor Barsdorf has served as an expert consultant to the World Health Organization and on the ethics of HIV prevention and vaccine trials. Our third speaker in the session is Professor Stephanie Burton. Professor Burton is a professor of biochemistry and professor at Future Africa at the University of Pretoria, as well as the immediate past vice principal for research and postgraduate education at the University of Pretoria. Her research interests are in sustainability, applied biochemistry, and biotechnology, and she's published widely and supervised numerous postgraduate students. Professor Burton has a strong interest in research ethics and integrity, and has given numerous colloquia on this topic in recent years. With that, Professor Singh, I hand over to you. I'm looking forward to the session and to the presentations by these three speakers. Thanks, Jesika.
Thank you very much, Prof. Corli, and for introducing the speakers in the session to us. And we're going to head into the first speaker for our session. But before we do that, I'm going to just remind the audience that if you want more information on our speakers, kindly look at the speakers' prospectus, and you can read up more about our speakers. And also remember to put your comments and questions into the chat box, and we will attend to it as soon as the speaker is done. So let me invite Prof. Ronaldo Munck to the platform, Dublin City University, where he's the director of the Center for Engaged Research. Over to you, Prof.
Thank you very much, Professor Singh and Professor Witthuhn, for the introductions there. I think it's a very valuable conference that you're organizing. I'm delighted to participate. As you mentioned there, I'm originally from Argentina, but I live in Ireland, and I run the civic engagement, engaged research effort of Dublin City University. But what's not probably known so much is that in 1994 to 1995, I was head of the sociology department at the University of Durban Westville. So I got to know some of the debates there at that time. I have followed since the work of Professor Jesika Reddy, who was our Vice-Chancellor at the time. And I also got to know Ahmed Bawa, who is, of course, the head of the organization who organizes this conference. Ahmed and myself did early civic engagement efforts in Durban Westville, myself as head of sociology, and he at that time was the Dean of Engineering. So that by the way of history. Now to the matter at hand. I've been asked to speak about research integrity. It means different things to different people, and I think that in a sense it is only natural. For myself, we use more the engaged research, but research integrity is also equally a fine term to have. And as was said in the introduction, it's about ethics and so on. So I've been doing this work off and on maybe for the last 20 or so years. In fact, since I was in South Africa in the mid-1990s. I think our discussion needs to be set in terms of the impact of the coronavirus crisis. I think that's fairly obvious. And some of you have been in the front line in South Africa in terms of dealing with that crisis. But I think myself, being a sociologist, I would also see it very much as combined with the impending sort of ecological impact of climate change, but also very much the economic of the crisis that has been engendered by the corona crisis. Not least, for example, the vast discrepancy in access to vaccines in the global north and the global south. I would posit this idea that we're living through what we could call a great recoil. It's a term from Hegel, believe it or not, when the coordinates of history seem to be reversed. Everything, in a sense, is being put into question today. What we've understood as globalization, freedom of movement, economic growth, who are friends, who are rivals in terms of the geopolitical nature of the world, all of that is being thrown into question. And I think it's causing disorientation and consternation. And I would imagine that would probably be the same in South Africa. What does this mean for engaged research? I think it means that we have to perhaps rethink how we understand it. We have to rethink its importance. You could argue that engaged research, ethical research is more important today. Is more important today. I'll give you one example that comes up here in Ireland in terms of, I suppose, what some people have referred to as a fairly successful way of dealing with the COVID crisis. One of the things that became very clear was the response by society to lockdowns, to the preventative measures, to the vaccination process, and so on and so forth. So in Ireland, you have the highest vaccination rates in Western Europe. I think it's hitting 95% of the eligible population. So the way society understands research is vital. So I think it points really to the need for more community engagement. And we understand community as a range of public research stakeholders. It can include public or professional service, product users, policymakers, civic society organizations, and other actors. But above all, that last sentence, engaged research is advanced with the community partners rather than for them. There's an old tradition in sociology of researching on communities. And you find the communities get a bit tired of being, if you want, the subjects of research. And that certainly is something I found in South Africa when going back once or twice on a number of research projects. One, for example, around water issues in the Cape Town region. Research can be a burden for communities, to be honest. So we need to look at ways around that. In terms of definitions, we find that at the heart of engaged research, what has often been referred to as the integration of theory and practice, and explicit reference on the role of the research in the process. When I do classes here for the masters or PhD students on why they might want to adopt engaged research instead of other more traditional research approaches, I would stress very much the issue of reflexivity. You know, who am I doing this research? Why am I doing this research? What impact am I having on the communities with whom I am working? And I suppose that would go against a very sort of scientific approach, if you want to call it that, where the researcher just assumes that doing research is a good thing. So what's the impact? What's the role of the researcher? And I suppose, what are the responsibilities of the researcher? People have promoted this idea of phronetic research. I also had to look it up in the dictionary. I didn't know what it was at first, but it's research that focuses on values and power to inform practical knowledge rather than abstract knowledge. I think that's important, that the knowledge that we need, especially in the midst of, or as we come out of the coronavirus crisis and all its economic consequences, which still haven't really been felt. So as I said earlier, reflexivity is key, continually questioning the design and impacts of your research, who it serves, what context it is operating in, who is included and excluded. I mean, just to say I have a community representative on the management board of a research project, like who is this person representing the community? Do they really? Is it possible to represent communities? All those are fair questions, but you only address them if you're reflexive. So I think reflexivity would be very much a key theme. Carry on the integrity issue. Sort of, you know, am I conducting this research in an ethical way? If your research is addressing a societal challenge or issue of public concern, have you engaged the stakeholders most affected? These are sort of checkpoints, checklists that we would propose to our masters and PhD students. Does the proposed research tap the expertise and tacit knowledge of both researchers and community members? I might be an expert on drugs, for example, but it's my local communities around Dublin City University who would know the impact on drugs and drug abuse within the communities on young people and so on. So that's tacit knowledge. It's not necessarily theoretical knowledge, but it is, of course, very valuable. Does the design of the research ensure the stakeholders and the researchers are clear about their collaboration, their respective roles and responsibilities? What will they gain from the research? And what will they be expected to contribute? I think it's a fair enough question for a community being asked to collaborate in research. What's in it for us? I think it's a fair question, especially if they have been researched a lot. So there's something in sociology we call the research bargain. And some people actually even sign research contracts with communities. I don't know if I'd go that far. I don't know what the practice is in South Africa these days. How will community members be recognized and acknowledged in research outputs? Do we just go and talk to these communities and then go off and publish in the normal way? How will this research result in positive steps towards addressing the issue of public concern or societal challenge? Every community, every group where I've done research always wants to know, they always want to know what's going to come from this. And there's no point saying, you know, poverty will be abolished in North Dublin through this project. No, it won't. But so what are the measures, what are the steps that might result from a particular project? And it's important to be honest in this and be realistic, but be constantly aware that people do wish to see something come out of the research that you're engaged in. What we're finding, this is an Irish sort of paradigm here, we're finding that different disciplines are coming together around this idea of engaged or ethical research. One theme, and I don't know if it's current in South Africa, it's very much a European term. The EU loves to have acronyms. So RRI is responsible research and innovation. We're very much twinning, and I believe you are as well, twinning research with innovation. So what you see in this wheel are the ways different players, if you want, competing interests of stakeholders relate to the research. You have donors, you have industry, you have government, the general public, the universities themselves, and researchers. So for public, this paradigm has referred to the general public's interest in the return of benefit for the tax dollars. So you see where this paradigm comes from, the US, that goes towards funding basic research. That hasn't been an issue really in Europe. In Europe, when we do research, they don't say, well, am I getting a benefit from my tax euros? It's more about the social benefit. But nevertheless, this is something now pointing to a new type of way, new way of doing research. So responsible research and innovation is one of the current paradigms, feeding into, I think, what you might call a real movement towards engaged research, and a movement that's going to become stronger, I believe, as we get over the coronavirus crisis. Another one that's very current, at least in my university and the other Irish universities, is PPI, public and patient involvement. Obviously, in the medical areas, which I understand some of you are coming from, DCU has a very strong sort of biomedical department, strong nursing department, and so on. So we have been promoting this PPI notion, a new way of doing research. So and you can see in this pyramid, it starts off with involvement, both the patients and the public work in partnership with researchers, plan, design, manage, evaluate, and disseminate research, genuine partnership all the way through. Engagement is ongoing. Researchers share information and knowledge about research, usually after it is complete. And participation, patients and the public are tested as subjects of a study. The question that it begs, in my mind anyway, would be public-patient involvement. Who is the public? It's a very broad category. In sociology, we'd be very wary of categories like public or community, and we would look for definition. And patient is then again also a very difficult term, because when you define your participants as patients, these people are already within the hospital system. So from my perspective, PPI is very good, it's very interesting, but we could say that it's a fairly passive involvement of patients and public. And the public often would mean relatives of people who are ill or sick or hospitalized. Okay, so we have RRI and now we have PPI, just to confuse you. What we've developed in Ireland as part of an organization called Campus Engage. Campus Engage is a broad umbrella organization of all the universities and the technicons, the colleges of the technical universities, which you used to call technicons anyway. And looking at the cycle of research from in the middle, the generating of ideas, the research planning and design stage, proposal development, project kickoff, data collection, data analysis, go around data access, knowledge production and exchange, and then finally dissemination. So in all of these stages, if we're doing engaged research, we need to look at ways of involving who. That's not clear. Obviously, you could say interested and relevant parties, but it is a break from the researcher maybe 50 years ago who would think that she or he had all the knowledge. I think we're breaking away from that idea that researchers hold the key to knowledge, and that knowledge is much more complex much more messy process. And I'm nearly coming to the end now. I'm conscious of the time. Very much would like to have time for discussion and conversation around these issues. I think particularly in the global south, the issue of democracy, the issue of development looms large. How do projects contribute to development? What does development mean? It's not just economic development, social development, cultural development, a whole series of ways that development needs to be addressed. And if you want the uneven development within a country like South Africa, and the parts that are developed and the parts that are less developed, and what research may contribute to overcome that uneven development. I suppose then the difference is between participation, and participatory research has been around for a long time, and then engagement. Is engagement, a higher form of participation? How is it structured? It's not easy, it's not obvious. And speaking as someone who promotes the idea, does this, works with people who do it, it's not always obvious. Like how, for example, do you get people from a community, deprived community near my university, and how do they get involved in writing up a paper on relative deprivation or drugs issues? It's not obvious, it's not easy, it's a challenge, but there you are. That in a nutshell is where we are at the moment in Ireland. Those are my thoughts on ethical research, engaged research, or research integrity. I'd be very interested to know if these ideas translate into a South African context or that they don't. But over to you, Chair, now.
And I will take over. Thank you very much, Prof, for taking us through your thoughts on this particular topic in terms of engaged research. And we do not have any questions on the chat at the moment. However, I just wanted to pick your brain a little bit more on that. We're talking about the engaged research and ethics in research and responsible research, some of the synonyms used for ethical research. When you're engaging with students, for example, what are the factors or the key ideas that we would tell students or even researchers that, am I conducting engaged research ethically? So what for you would be the standpoints of this particular engaged research? If somebody says, am I doing this correctly? What would be for you, this is what you actually need to be doing?
Sorry, that really is the key question. And I believe that working with students is crucial. A couple of years ago, just by way of example, our MBA in the business school, they were looking for projects for their students, and I came up with an idea that a local community group in Ballymun, that's the area where we are. In fact, it was a women's movement community group, were looking for help in setting themselves up as a viable organization. So this group from the business school, there were 4 or 5 of them. They came in for 6 months as part of this project, and some worked on the website, some worked on financial strategies, others worked on publicity. They made a fantastic difference. They loved it. The women's group loved having the students there. The students won the prize for best MBA project that year. So it was a win-win all around. But if you ask me, how does that happen? It happens by doing it. So I think the advice for students and for early career researchers is to go out there and do it. It's something that you only learn in practice. But we've had a lot of good examples here. someone's asking the similarities with South Africa. I think it's for you to tell me where things are at the moment. Maybe the other speakers will illuminate this topic.
Thanks very much, Prof, for your response. And then maybe just to bring the session to a close and ask you, I heard you speaking about the PPI and the RRI and trying to confuse us. However, I wanted to also pick up on the PPI, the public patient involvement. Currently we're going through this pandemic worldwide.
Yes.
And, the coronavirus, which you mentioned also in your introduction, together with other environmental issues that are really perturbing us in this day and age. But if you look at the public patient involvement, especially there's a lot going around with the coronavirus and the COVID-19 issues regarding ethics and sharing of information and, what's personal information. And there's a lot related to vaccinations, etc. So what is your take in terms of the current status of what is happening around the world in terms of the public patient, the public and the patient, and how we engage with patients, especially in the coronavirus era?
Yes, well, I'm not. I'm really not an expert on medical ethics or anything like that. What I have sensed here in Ireland is PPI is as good as the people who are doing it. They're very, if you want, the government says, you should do this, and people go off and do it, but it doesn't really work. On the ethics question, I would have imagined that in many ways, with the coronavirus crisis, the ethics question comes secondary. Like I'm signed up on my phone to a network that tracks me and tracks people around me and tells me if I have come into contact with someone with COVID. Now that breaches the government's own, in Europe, there are very strong personal data protection laws, but that clearly breaches it because the government is tracking my movement and where I go. But people agree to it because they want to agree to it. You can opt out of it. That's actually fine. Can I just address someone's there saying a burning question in South Africa, that there's a sense of impending social disaster, inequality, poverty, unemployment, looting, etc. Reminds one of the anti-apartheid context where everyone had to do their bit in the struggle, relevance. Can you say more about the method of participatory action research? I think that's maybe one for another day. PAR obviously was very much a 1970s, if you want, paradigm. Does engaged research take up some of those? I think it does. Like Paulo Freire would be quite an important precursor of engaged research. But I think it's a new generation. Some of us can go back to that anti-apartheid generation as well. But it's a good question. It is a good question.
Thanks very much, Prof, for your insights into this particular area, into this topic as well. And thank you so much for your presentation. We thoroughly enjoyed that. And it is now time for us to move on to our second speaker.
Thank you.
Thanks, Prof. Thank you. It's now time to move on to our second speaker, speaker 2 in the session. And it is my pleasure for us to welcome Dr. Nicola Barsdorf. She is the Research Integrity Officer at the University of Stellenbosch. Welcome to you, Nicola, and over to you. Thank you.
Thank you kindly, Chair. I'm just going to share my screen. And just a quick tech check that everyone can see the slides.
Yes.
Yes, we can. Thanks.
Great. So thanks. I guess before I start, just to say thanks for the opportunity to be able to talk about research integrity in this very important conference. And today I've titled my presentation, Research Integrity and the Engaged University, Bolstering Society's Trust in the broader academic project. So to outline what we'll be talking about over the next 20 minutes is what is research integrity, why it's important, what are questionable research practices, and what drives those, so that we can get a better idea of how to prevent it. And then I will finish off by talking about how the engaged university can foster integrity in research. So to start with, what is research integrity? A definition that I like as an ethicist is it's an active adherence to the ethical principles and professional standards that are essential for RCR. Here's another one of those acronyms: responsible conduct of research. And when we talk about ethics principles and professional standards in the field of integrity, we're talking about honesty, responsibility, trustworthiness, fairness, accountability, and then very importantly, a high regard for the scientific record. And if we ask ourselves, well, why is research integrity important? I think it mostly rests on this idea of trust. It's the basis for researchers' trust in each other and the standard to which we conduct our research. It's the basis for researchers' trust in the research record or the findings that we share with the rest of the world. And it's the basis for society's trust in research evidence and expertise. And, you know, as a follow-on to that, society's trust in the general academic project and what we put out there and share with society. And I think trust in research is earned, especially society's trust in research is earned by scientists being transparent and by performing research that's relevant to the society, that's ethically sound, and that is of high quality. You know, on the other hand, if we have sloppy research or questionable research practices, those can then start to undermine public trust in the academic project or the research endeavor. And they can also start to distort the evidence base. And over the next few slides, I'm going to give you a look at some examples of how sloppy research can distort the evidence base. So this is just a recent article in Science magazine, which talked to a grossly irresponsible study claiming that COVID vaccines kill. And there were a number of vaccinologists, respected vaccinologists, that quit the journal board of the journal Vaccines because they claimed that the study misused data by firstly making the incorrect assumption that all deaths that occurred in that study after vaccination were caused by the vaccination itself. And therefore they concluded that for 3 deaths prevented by vaccination, we have to accept 2 inflicted by vaccination. And there's you know, in the research ethics and integrity field, we often refer to this as, well, garbage in, garbage out. If the way you conduct the analysis or the way you manipulate the data is in some way making incorrect assumptions, or you've got bad research design, what comes out is going to be as bad as what goes in. And it's very unfortunate in this case because this article has already been used by anti-vaxxers and COVID deniers as evidence that vaccines are not safe. Historically, we've seen similar things happen too. So we've seen how questionable research practices can distort the evidence base and affect public opinion, and also affect public buy-in for important public health interventions such as vaccines. And, you know, we can think back to the original 1998 Lancet article by Wakefield, which linked the MMR vaccine and autism. I mean, it was later shown to be fraudulent, and there's been a number of more recent publications, one in the BMJ and one in Nature, that have talked about the discredited doctor sort of who was hailed by the anti-vaccine movement, and that, you know, he's been stripped of his ability to practice medicine. But, you know, what we've learned from this is that many, many years later, he still has quite a big following, which is having an impact on public buy-in for vaccination. So how does this happen? And I wanted to look a bit at the evidence or data for how this happens. And The Economist published an article in June this year, which labeled dubious research or questionable research practices as zombie research. And I think, you know, how it happens that it starts to distort the evidence base is that dubious research kind of stays in the academic literature or haunts the academic literature long after it's retracted. And this Economist article referred to this research as zombie research and said, well, this zombie research haunts the academic literature long after its supposed demise. But the idea is that the problem with dubious research is that even in the cases that we identify an erroneous publication or a poor study where the publication needs to be retracted, those publications continue to be cited in the academic literature long after the retraction. And the Economist article provides a wonderful graphic, which I think just, you know, for those of us that don't like looking at all the figures, presents a really wonderful visual way of seeing the impact that this can have. And if you look at this graphic, the top line is giving an indicator of the papers that were retracted because of errors. And the middle line is citations of those retracted papers that, you know, those papers show those papers continue to be cited. And the bottom bar is citations of papers that cited the original retracted papers. So you can see that what happens over time is even if a publication is identified as erroneous and it's retracted in the 70s or the 80s or 90s, there seems to be this follow-on of citations. And, you know, the most obvious example here is the big red circle showing 650,000 citations of a previously retracted article. And this just gives a great visual of how this dubious research distorts the integrity of the evidence base and maybe pushes an idea that should have somehow removed itself from the scientific community through retraction, but did not. And we all know we disseminate research findings because we want to accumulate evidence, and we want to accumulate this evidence to inform decision-making and clinical practice. We want to influence policy and government spending and determine future lines of research. But if dubious research distorts the integrity of the evidence base, it's easy to follow that it can also misinform policy. It can end up misinforming policy and government spending and the direction of future research. And so, you know, I've cited here two studies, a recent systematic review and meta-analysis of survey data that looks at how many scientists fabricate and falsify research. And then a much more recent Dutch study from 2021 that looked at the prevalence of questionable research practices and research misconduct. And what these two studies show is that shady research practices are not that uncommon. The graphic that I've created on the left is at the top is RCR, or this responsible conduct of research. And we know that there is a fair amount of this happening globally and nationally. And at the bottom is research misconduct. So that's your classic research integrity violations of fabrication and falsification of data and plagiarism. But in the middle is this very sort of grayish area of questionable research practices. And what these two studies have shown is while research misconduct is fairly uncommon, relatively speaking, we're looking at between 2 to 14% of scientists admitting to participating in research misconduct. The questionable research practices are much larger, and we're looking at anything between 33 to 50% of researchers actually admitting to this. And even if we take this on conservative grounds, it means that 1 in 3 scientists is admitting to using questionable research practices. And if we sort of take this back to thinking about how this could distort the evidence base, the impact can be quite severe. So what are these questionable research practices? They include things like poor data management, poor mentorship and supervision. Unsurprisingly, mentorship and supervision came out in those studies as one of the strongest indicators of conducting responsible research that's responsible. Salami slicing publications, not managing conflicts of interest appropriately, in general, sort of sloppy science, improper allocation of authorship, and then a failure to follow generally accepted research procedures. So I wanted to just take a look at what drives questionable research practices, with the proviso that obviously it's never justified, but it is important for us to recognize potential drivers of misconduct so we can better understand how they might be prevented. And this visual is quotes from people who admitted to research conduct in closed Office of Research Integrity cases. This is in the Office of Research Integrity at the NIH. And what they show is essentially it's a variety of categories of drivers. Some of it's again mentioning poor supervision, being too scared to go to their supervisor or their PI, inadequate training. A big factor has been competitive pressures, so wanting to publish a lot or in high-profile journals in order to advance a person's faculty position, and then personal circumstances and individual psychology. What I've done for this slide is taken the results from four recent studies, which I've cited at the bottom, to put together a list of factors that the research is showing are driving questionable research practices. Things like career and funding pressures, perverse incentives, the ones bolded on the left, and the poor mentoring and supervision have come across as quite strong drivers of questionable research practices, in addition to sort of institutional failures of oversight, commercial and personal conflicts of interest, inadequate training. There's also personal circumstances, as identified in the NIH2, individual psychology, and then sometimes it can be part of a larger pattern of social deviance, and sometimes it's just about this perception of a low probability of detecting misbehavior, or a perception on the part of the person that it's unlikely that they're going to get caught. And while in real life it's obviously very messy, what we can do is group these drivers of questionable research into two broad categories, and the one on the right is really about looking at the virtuousness of the individual. But the ones on the left, really we can attribute to the research climate of an institution. And it's not this neat, but I think it helps us to look at these drivers from these two different perspectives if we want to think about how to prevent questionable research. I just wanted to look at the one which was perverse incentives as an example. So in 2019 in Nature, there was a publication by a South African academic, David Heading, who claimed that payouts push professors towards predatory journals. And he said if South Africa truly wants to encourage good research, must stop paying academics by the paper. The paper essentially claims that publication subsidies will corrode the quality of scholarship in South Africa, or currently do. They also discourage collaboration broadly because, he claims in this paper that if you have these payouts for publications, researchers are unwilling to share the funds, and so this sort of discourages collaboration on publications. But also that it promotes several other counterproductive practices like salami slicing and targeting low quality journals that are deemed less demanding. Of course, this is a controversial topic, but if I try and think through this as an ethicist and a social scientist, if I think through how perverse incentives may work, we can think about a pay per publication system as a strong behavioral incentive. And we know that all incentives can and will be gamed if the stakes are high. So incentives work well for the intended effects, and this incentive has produced more publications, and we can see it works well for that intended effect. But it also works very well for unintended effects, such as a focus on quantity instead of quality, or more plagiarism and duplicate publication, salami slicing, gift authorship, etc. And just in general, less time-consuming responsible research practices. The bottom line, I think, if we're thinking about this from an institutional standpoint, is that incentives matter. And when we are thinking about the kinds of incentives that we have in place, we need to avoid the unintended effects. And this doesn't only apply to this idea of, for example, paper publication, but also to things like the rules for the appointment of professors and tenure tracks. Are these relying exclusively, for example, on measures of quantity? rather than, sort of adding on additional measures of quality or responsible conduct of research. And it also might apply to how we should assess a researcher for career advancement in general. So if we think about fostering integrity in research and putting measures in place to try and prevent it, to try and prevent research misconduct or questionable research practices, it would have to come from two sides. And the one is obviously, as individual researchers through virtuous behavior, but also, there would be a responsibility for research institutions, funders, and journal editors to also try and put systems into place that foster integrity in research. I'm close to the end, and so this slide is really just an idea of talking about how can the engaged university foster integrity in research. And there are 5 key areas that I think are important. The first, obviously, being to invest adequately in research integrity capacity within the institution. And I think, what we see in South Africa is that the field of research integrity, or integrating a sort of office of research integrity into a university as an institution, is relatively new. And relative to other support structures in the university, is often not invested in as much as, say, for example, the support for funding applications or contracts or information governance and those kinds of things. And I think it is important for us as higher education institutions to consider what is adequate investment. Are we providing enough capital, human resources, as well as finance to build that into the institution so that it can work. Obviously, providing training is another way that the engaged university can foster integrity. Training in research ethics and research integrity is evolving in South Africa, and at Stellenbosch we have a number of different training programs, and are moving towards the idea of making training in research ethics and integrity mandatory at some point, so that we, as we get new researchers and new students coming into the institution, there's this level of exposure to this training that will help. Obviously, ensuring familiarity with the ethics codes and guidelines, and then, as those 2 studies showed, improving supervision of postgraduates towards responsible conduct of research. And then finally, creating a healthy publication climate. So I really enjoy the cartoon on the right on the evolution of academia, because I think it kind of accurately shows how academia and the rewards for it have evolved. And it started off with being published, and then it was publish or perish, and then publish in high impact journals or perish. And finally, what we currently experience is academics publish frequently in high impact journals, and maybe you won't perish. And I think it does, in a sense, capture the incredible pressure that we find ourselves under as academics to publish in order to advance our careers. And here, we have an opportunity for an institution to create a healthy publication climate, which incentivizes researchers to optimize quality and integrity rather than merely quantity. And so the next 2 slides are just examples of models that have been developed. The first one on this page has come out of the Hong Kong principles for assessing researchers, which was an output of one of the more recent World Congress on Research Integrity. And this is an example, I guess, of how to change the game without ignoring the numbers. We don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but perhaps there are ways of measuring or creating indicators to measure success throughout the research process, from the time that a study is being formulated right through to the point of publication, where we can measure other variables of responsible research practices besides how many publications are coming out of a particular study or a particular academic environment. I also wanted to just highlight a more recent Nature article from last year that is directed specifically at the institutional responsibility for research integrity, and proposes 9 ways to move from talk to walk. And again, this is, sort of saying how can institutions share resources to promote best practices in science. And again, they sort of propose a variety of categories that an institution can use to start to assess the quality of research rather than just publication numbers. So in conclusion, I think when we're thinking about the quality of research, the engaged university ought to create a climate that encourages and supports researchers in actively adhering to ethical principles and professional standards, so that there is the responsible conduct of research. And, the engaged university ought also to recognize that failure to create this kind of climate may contribute to the erosion of public trust in the academic project, because, if those numbers of 1 in 3 scientists participating in questionable research practices is to increase or even stay at that level, that is going to have an impact on the trust in the academic project by the general public. So just to say thank you very much for your time, and I'm happy to take some questions in the time that's remaining.
Thank you very much, Prof. Nicola, and for that very, very insightful talk. Presentation. There's so many things that you've raised there, and the questionable research and the damage that it does, the issue of incentives. And on the issue of incentives, I can see that we have a comment that we do have a funding model in place in South Africa in the higher education sector, and we just want to hear your thoughts on amending these formulas, and how it can be done to promote a more ethical research. If you can start with that one first.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I don't think I have all the answers to that, but I think, in principle, at the moment, we know we have this incentive system in South Africa, and it's working very well to increase research productivity and research outputs in the form of publications. And I think, the 2 examples that I've used in the presentation of models that don't throw the baby out with the bathwater are probably the direction that we need to be moving in. So we don't, publication outputs are a good incentive. We can keep it there. It will continue to have the intended effect. And we should probably be adding some other measures or indicators of performance that focus on quality and integrity. And we add those to the mix in terms of evaluating the success of various environments or individuals.
Thanks very much, Nicola. And one of our participants has also asked you a specific question, and relating to the fact that is there any authentic source for data? This comes to our mind quite a bit when we see all these questionable, and you did give us possible percentages of questionable research. Is there any authentic source for data about COVID-19, given that most such data have been politicized and the WHO relies on individual country reports? What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, if the question is directed at the kinds of publications that are coming out and which ones we can trust and which ones we can't, I think I can point to one valuable platform called Retraction Watch, which has its own specific category devoted to COVID research, and they've been tracking that quite closely, along with research in other fields. But obviously, with the pandemic over the last 2 years, they've had a focused category on this, and that I think is a very accurate way for us as academics to check in on the papers that might have made it into the public sphere, but then were identified as being erroneous or questionable and have been retracted.
Thank you very much, Prof. Nicola Barsdorf. And if you can stop sharing your screen, we just want to appreciate you, and the content was very interesting, and I think we can engage further on that as well. And now we move on to our third speaker for this session. And our speaker is Professor Stephanie Burton from the University of Pretoria, where she is a professor, Future Africa, and Faculty of Natural in the Faculty of Natural and Agricultural Sciences. I also want to say who Prof. Burton as well, who must add this point. was last week awarded with the Management Award at the National Science and Technology Forum Annual Awards ceremony. And that's hot off the press. So congratulations, Prof. Burton, from all of us here. And we look forward to listening to your talk. Over to you, Prof. Burton.
Thank you very much. Thanks for that, Jesika. And greetings to all of the colleagues and friends who I know are in this conference at the moment. I'm going to take a fairly pragmatic view of the ideas around an engaged university and research integrity. I am a researcher myself, as Jesika said, in the natural sciences field, and have worked in this area a long time, but I have increasingly been interested in what is going on in the country in terms of the external view of the university and what the public are understanding about the work that we are doing and the research integrity. So my talk is a little bit more outward looking and certainly related to some of the work I've been doing most recently with our National Government Communications and Information Service in reporting on research which has been done and the way it has been communicated. So let me share my screen, and there we go. So let me start with that, the idea of, first of all, the engaged university. We talk quite easily about what we mean, but I want to just talk a little about what it is. From the point of view of science being a public good, there's a definition of science for you there, which comes from the International Science Council in terms of pursuit and application of knowledge based on systematic methodology and evidence. So when we talk about science and we talk about the kind of work we do as researchers, we tend to say this relates to social justice, it relates to freedom of expression, academic freedom, and about cultivating intellectual capacity to enable meaningful lives. And that's my starting point. I'm also going to talk a little bit about communities' understanding of information and community participation in research activities, which are very key to a university being engaged. And then I'll come to the value for scientific endeavors and the support and trust which my colleagues in this session have also mentioned. So when we look at the engaged university, this is what I think we need to be thinking about in terms of our research. Turning to research integrity, we've got lots of definitions and we've talked broadly about it. Let me start from a slightly different point of view, and that is, why do we do the research in the first place? Well, we do the research to generate new knowledge and to find answers to questions, to solve problems, and address challenges that we face at this time in the 21st century, particularly viewing it as a digital, connected, and information-driven world. The point is, the research we do needs to create impact for a better future, and it needs to facilitate innovation in its broadest sense for the benefit of society. So there's all these words that pop up all the time about quality and ethics and rights and responsibilities and relevance and impact. And I'm going to talk a little bit about each of those as I go through this talk. Let's start with a bit about research integrity being about respecting rights and responsibilities. That's about how we conduct our research. So when we talk about the rights and responsibilities and obligations, what do we mean by that? Well, rights come with the rights of everybody who we are dealing with. It's respecting the rights of our fellow academics in terms of academic freedom. It's about providing an enabling environment for people to conduct research. It's about accessing facilities and having freedom from discrimination and abuse. So those are something about the rights of academics and what we can expect. We accept responsibilities too in terms of social responsibility, and making sure that we are aware of social justice, as I said, benevolence, respect for individuals, and professionalism. And then the duties and obligations that we have are very diverse. I just mentioned a few here. We can consider many others, but the duties and obligations that I just want to highlight a little are those of, for example, whistleblowing, codes of ethics, I'll mention those again in a moment, and then protecting reputations. So looking across that list of good things, this is the start of research integrity from the individual point of view and from an institutional point of view. Moving on from that, of course, there is the ethical conduct of research, and that in itself is central to what we talk about when we say we have research integrity. And every university has a code of conduct, every research institution has a code of conduct. And it talks again about lofty ideals around value and dignity, the promotion of knowledge, the pursuit of truth, the responsibility about how our research is conducted, the obligation of researchers to engage with critical self-discipline and judgment in terms of using knowledge and disseminating it, and of course, respecting the authority of professional codes of conduct and in particular disciplines. Also really important and something that has been mentioned already, but in the sense of reporting what we do, reporting our research, we do expect that researchers will subscribe to the principles of honesty and completeness and clarity and accountability and exposure to public testing. I'll come back to that one in a moment. So this is the kind of values and ideals that we have in all of our codes of ethics. So that's been going a long time. In fact, I think many universities' codes of ethics go back decades, many decades. But what's changed recently? Well, a lot has changed recently. Our world in terms of academia has changed dramatically in the last 20 years, in particular in relation to publications, and I'm coming to that. But in the last 2 years, of course, we've had the dramatic change of suddenly having a pandemic to deal with. And the questions I think we need to ask are, how are we responding to that as universities? So there's two main aspects I'm going to go to now. The first is research and production of new knowledge, and the second one I'll come to is about publication and communication. So research, how do we do it? Well, we need to ask about what research we do. As an engaged university, is our research relevant and meaningful, and will it bring benefit to society? And we need to ask ourselves how we are doing that research. A lot of the research that we do, it does involve going into communities and gathering information. And so we need to be saying, what are we doing with the data that we gather? You know, there's the kind of data, I said this to a colleague this morning, the kind of data that I used to gather was gathered in laboratory notebooks and maintained as an archive of data which could then be referred to. More and more, though, the data that we gather involves individuals and communities, and it becomes increasingly important that we manage and protect that data very carefully. We do have in place in most institutions ways in which we do that, increasingly electronic, digital, searchable, and therefore hackable. So one does need to think about how you manage data. And then, of course, there's the idea of using secondary data. In other words, data that somebody else, some other organization or researcher has collected. And we have responsibilities around the responsible use of secondary data and acknowledgement, of course, of where that data came from. Turning to publication and communication, the questions are about how we publish and where we publish, who pays for the publication, and that's a very key issue in terms of ethics. And then, of course, who has access to what we publish. So let's explore those a little more. As institutions conducting research and as researchers, we need to have standards, not just standards for what we think is ethical, but they need to be realistic and reliable and believable by others. So we put in place systems. We have ethics approvals management in all our institutions, nationally and as organizations. We have regulations and policies and committees and processes, and increasingly important, compliance monitoring. which in itself is technical and complex. But we still need to be asking ourselves, how can we be sure, and there isn't a Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Research in the world who wouldn't be asking themselves regularly, how can we be sure that we are managing our ethics processes appropriately? We put in place training to support that, training for ethical research and research integrity. And Nicola mentioned that we all have programs of those sorts where we need to involve people. I think that that needs to start at the undergraduate levels as much as for researchers. And there needs to be ongoing refresher courses and community information. So here's an important thing. Our communities around us need to know what we are doing about ethical research training and about our ethical management. They need to be able to trust that too. I've mentioned research data management. I won't say much more about it, but it is critical that we collate and save and archive our data and provide appropriate access to the institutional repositories so that the public can see how we are doing that management of data and that they can access it. And then the other part of the realistic standards is to have responsible reporting and exploitation of our findings to enable innovation. That means covering intellectual property. It means managing the responsible development of intellectual property for innovation. Those are all practical ideas around what universities or research organizations need to do. The next part of it that I think is critical is how we communicate that. Because we all understand that we have research results that we should be publishing, reporting to the global scientific community. And that's about new knowledge and it's about learning that's been achieved. But there's another dimension to it, which I think is important, and that is that we must actively share those research outcomes as widely as we can. Those results need to be available for translation into action because society needs to benefit from contributions to new developments. If we don't publish, there's no point really, or there's little point in conducting the research. And if the stakeholders, aside from our own immediate circle, can't see what we publish, then they won't have the opportunity to benefit from that new knowledge. And that's what we do it for. At least that's what we say we do it for. And here's the real important thing about that. If we don't communicate our research, the broader community will not benefit. And we and they, quite rightly, might question the value and the impact of the research that we are doing. In fact, you will all be aware that there's globally a lot of questioning as to the value of research and the value of universities, because the broader community is not necessarily convinced of the value of what we are doing. So when we publish research results, well, there's some trends which we need to be aware of. The one is the trend towards open access publishing, which really refers broadly to making our results available to everyone. And of course, making it freely available. This is a global movement. I'm sure I don't need to explain it to the academics in the audience, but it is critical that we think about the impact of open access publishing in terms of responsibility and research integrity. And I use a quote which I know you will have seen me use before, but one which I think is critical. And that is that because our publishing is becoming increasingly open and open to everyone, it is absolutely mandatory that we make sure that we write so that not just that the reader might understand us, but so that it is impossible for the reader to misunderstand us. In other words, to misinterpret. That's a key concept, I think, when we consider what we are putting into the public domain. There is also another trend which is important at the moment, and that is the trend towards publication online even prior to review. And there is the issue of peer review, which comes with that. Colleagues will be aware of the trend at the moment, and it is one which has accelerated enormously since the start of the pandemic. As soon as research data becomes available, it can be put into a publication platform where it is open to the public even without having been reviewed by peers or experts in the field, and therefore the data is open to interpretation. That means that anybody can take a look at that publication, that data, and make their own interpretations, and then they can make comments and they can publish or announce what they interpret as the meaning of that data. So scientists may be, as Nicola was saying, perhaps not entirely responsible. It may not be high quality data, and it may be misinterpreted. Then there's the unethical practice of publication in predatory journals, and we've heard a little bit about paying authors, but there's also the issue of paying to have an article published by a journal which is soliciting those publications without necessarily having much academic standing or credible peer review. Authors do pay sometimes to have articles published in journals, but the critical part of this is that there needs to be a reliable and credible peer review, or else there's no basis for ensuring the quality, the truth, the meaning, and the value of that research. And that might lead to some very tenuous conclusions being made by reviewers, by readers, and even by the authors. So these three issues of trends which we need to be aware of in terms of our research integrity and in terms of the way in which it is received by our broader community. So just a little more about the ethical communication part, considering that so much is open online. In fact, if you think about it, there is completely open access to an awful lot of information on the internet. Scientific reports and publications are made available, and any reader who happens to be searching for information will come across those publications and reports. This is a data-driven world, and what is available on the internet is very often taken to be true. I resisted putting up one of those cartoons about this, but I think it's completely relevant that we say to each other, and people say to each other, I found it on the internet. How did you find it? You found it by using Google. And that means that people tend to believe what they find. The danger is just not only in the disingenuous misrepresentation, but it's about the possibility of misleading readers, and particularly naive readers who may not be equipped to differentiate when there is misrepresentation. And there are many unfounded assertions can be found, and naive reader may well act on those with a multitude of possible unfortunate consequences. We need only think back to the beginning of the pandemic, when one of our global leaders recommended the use of bleach to avoid being contaminated by the coronavirus, and the damage that did. There are many stories, but this is the point about the fact that information can be misinterpreted and can easily mislead naive readers. And then let's turn to the future and this information era and the impact of digital technologies on integrity and engagement. Well, managing research data is increasingly important, as I said, but it's also increasingly unmanageable because the amount of data which is being generated is increasing by the second. You can find that information if you have a look on Google. There is an enormous amount of data which is out there now. If we take a look at publicly funded research, well, that's increasingly obligatory in terms of putting it out there publicly. And the digital access to our data is becoming a requirement for public funding. So we need not just institutional systems for managing our research data, we need global systems for managing research data. And that brings us to new technologies which pose new questions. We know about artificial intelligences. There are many references and discussions around how artificial intelligences can help us, for example, in detecting fraudulent data and plagiarism. But we need to ask ourselves how we know how to trust artificial intelligences and what they tell us. Well, there are data scientists who may be listening to this. There are certainly colleagues who are able to answer that question, but it's one we should be aware of. You can't simply implicitly trust that because an artificial intelligence system has been used, it's correct. It depends on who set it up. So we need to ask ourselves, can we ethically allow artificial intelligence to do research for us? For example, searching the literature. We need to know where the artificial intelligences come from and how they were set up and what their algorithms are and where there might be weaknesses. And then there's the question of, as an engaged university, should we be allowing our students to use automation and artificial intelligences to help them to find information? And I ask myself this question: if we allow that, and I mean, we will, and we do, what are our students learning? Will they learn? Will they be learning for themselves, or will they simply believe and fall into those traps of the internet era and believing what they read without interrogating it? And then there's the pandemic and what we've had to deal with that. And the questions we need to be asking ourselves about engaging are about whether people listen to the scientists, and are they listening to us as the academic scholarly community who consider ourselves to be ethical? I think the issue of science engagement involving conversations with community becomes absolutely critical. And our opinions as scientists interest people. The community out there, more broadly, are really interested in what we have to say and what our opinions are. But the question is, who is talking and how many of us are being listened to? This is something which fascinates me, and in fact, I am spending a lot of time at the moment thinking about who are the scientists who are being listened to and who trusts them. And you only need to look at the headlines around things like the vaccine hesitancy that we are so aware of at the moment to see that we are not necessarily being convincing as scientists ourselves. So just to end off, I want to just talk a little bit about the fact of building trust. How do we do that? Well, I think we need to build effective communication about risks. We need to tackle disinformation, and we need to strengthen the role of official sources. There was a question earlier, how can we believe data? We need to strengthen the role of the official sources of data so that they can be believed. And then, of course, I think we need to develop better communication strategies for advice and policy, using evidence-based information, make it fit for the purpose of communication, make it flexible, and make sure that we do counter stigmatization and the various different discourses that are there. There are many reports on this. In fact, there have been many in the scientific media, but this is just an example of one in terms of preparedness and management and lessons learned. All of this comes down to building trust as an engaged university, as an engaged community. There's lots of opportunities for doing that. We know that science is changing and we have this data-intensive world, and we can use all of these technologies to enable us to communicate better and to manage those issues around what is ethical. We have the open science and open access, which we can provide for the public, and we can be innovative about that as long as we are aware of it. And then, of course, our first speaker spoke extensively about inclusivity and co-creation, and we can engage with our communities in the science that we develop much more effectively than we do. I think the other part of co-creation and inclusivity that we don't often speak about is the government role players who can be consulted and who can be informed and whose policies can be influenced if we take this approach. So finally, I think what we're really saying is that we need to build a science culture in our communities. We need to build community linkages with all of our communities, ensure education which extends beyond the walls of our universities, and become influencers. Our research experts and public figures need to become influencers. This is not something I'm going to read to you, but the reference is available to you. And that is a debate which has been available for a while in terms of the discourse around what you have to do to develop a science culture and to develop the conversations in our communities. Of course, I'm not going to read all of this either, but there are many other key issues we need to engage with besides the pandemic around the sustainability, about education, about health and discrimination and climate change. These are also issues we can engage our communities with, and we should. So in conclusion then, as researchers and academics, our role is to enable. We must enable our communities to identify value and appreciate ethics and high-quality scientific practices. And we should be enabling our colleagues and our partners and our stakeholders to evaluate for themselves the integrity of our research. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Burton, for that very enlightening talk. And I think from our audience, we are getting, the question about, we find a lot of this, what we are talking about as researchers in journals, and which is not accessible to the community. And I think you alluded to that in your second or two slides from the end, the community linkages. So let's just build on that very briefly, Prof. Burton. If we're looking at the broader community, and that seems to be a weakness or a weak point in terms of, consulting, engaging, going back and taking the community along with us. So what can be done to strengthen this aspect of research in line with the, the theme of the conference, and that is the engaged university and the whole concept of what we heard earlier about responsible research? What are some of your thoughts of practical things that we can do? And I can hear that the audience is also, weighing in with each other along those lines as well. Prof?
Thank you. You will know that this is one of my recent great interests and hobby horses, if you like. I think it's critical that scientists see themselves as being responsible for speaking out about what they know and what their information is. That's not something simple. Being able to engage with the public and explain science is something for which we need to train. We need to develop the skills. We need to understand the level of our public awareness. If you speak with any particular community, you need to start from their position and from what they already understand and what they already believe. And let us not forget that any community has their own set of beliefs and traditions and culture, and that is their starting point. So we need to understand that, and then we need to understand how to interpret our technical and sometimes very academic reports. We need to be able to interpret those in a way that the public will understand. There are many outlets, if you like, for that. We do have publications in the public media. For example, The Conversation is a very useful one. But the other part of it, of course, which is perhaps a little controversial in this learned audience, but it's social media. And there are many ways in which you can use social media to inform the public in a more concise and sometimes more useful way. And then, of course, we have, I think, an important resource in the science journalists that we have. Those of us who do spend some time engaging on social media will know that there are several organizations in this country, and of course many internationally, where science journalists work to interpret new reports and new information. But they need to engage with the scientists themselves, the researchers who are developing new ideas and new theories. And that conversation, my final comment on this, those conversations between new discoveries, researchers, and communities need to be in many cases in real time or in short time. We can't rely on the long, protracted times that it takes to publish in the traditional scientific journals and then hope that people will look at it later. I think we need to become a little bit more active in real terms, in real time.
Thank you very much, Prof. Burton, for those wonderful insights into what we should actually be doing to engage our communities and taking our science out to them so that it can make an impact, because we do use these communities to gather our data, and who best to take it back to is the very communities, for them to be able to change their lifestyles, their lives, the way in which they communicate, live, and also at the end of the day to better the lives of the people that we engage with. And that brings us to the end of our session 8E on research integrity and the engaged university. And I just want to say thank you to all the presenters for these insightful presentations, and it has really got us thinking, and also it has really got our audience talking about it. So thank you very much, presenters. I also want to acknowledge the audience. You have been engaging and participating in the 3 different presentations. So your comments, especially the comments appreciating the presenters, is highly appreciated by the presenters. And I want to also acknowledge the USAf admin team in the background, as well as Birgit for monitoring and comments as well. So I think finally what's left for me to do is to wish you all a very, very tasty lunch, and to also ask you all to enjoy the rest of the conference. So from this session, we would like to bring the session to a close and wish you all a very, very pleasant day ahead. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye to you.